Vivian Carrington stepped into the woodshop and stopped. Her daughter was sitting next to a man in a sawdust-covered apron, their shoulders almost touching. "This is what you chose?" Elise stood up. Vivian didn't look at her. She looked at Garrett. "You fix old furniture. My daughter runs an empire. Where do you see yourself in that picture?" Garrett said nothing. Vivian turned to Elise. "Home. Now." Then back to Garrett, voice dropping. "If I see you near my daughter again, I will erase you from this city." She walked out. The man she'd just dismissed held 14 patents worth $80 million. 3 weeks earlier, Elise Carrington had driven down Broughton Street with a contractor list and a problem. Carrington House, the flagship hotel her family had owned since 1890, needed a full interior restoration. Not a renovation, not a modern refit. The original woodwork, the hand-carved moldings, the heart pine floors that had survived 130 years of coastal humidity, all of it needed someone who understood what they were touching. She found the shop by accident. No sign out front, just a narrow storefront wedged between a gallery and a coffee roaster. Through the window she could see a man bent over a table, running his hand along a piece of oak the color of dark honey. She pushed the door open. A bell didn't ring. Nothing announced her. Garrett Hollis looked up, nodded once, and went back to sanding. He was 40, broad-shouldered, with hands that moved over the wood, with a precision that looked almost surgical. Elise introduced herself. Just her first name. She described the project: 18 rooms, period-accurate restoration, 12-month timeline. Garrett listened without interrupting. When she finished, he shook his head. "I work one piece at a time. I don't do production runs." Elise had heard that kind of refusal before. Usually it meant the price wasn't right. But Garrett hadn't asked about money. He'd said it the way someone states a fact about themselves, not a negotiation, just a boundary. She tried a different angle. "This isn't production. Every piece in that building is original. 1890s craftsmanship. Hand-cut mortise and tenon joints. I'm not looking for someone to replicate it. I'm looking for someone who can read it." Garrett set down his sandpaper. For the first time, he looked at her with something other than polite indifference. He led her through the back of the shop, past racks of reclaimed lumber and shelves of hand-forged hardware. He showed her a dresser he was restoring, pointed out where the original joiner had compensated for a warped board by adjusting the angle of every tenon in the drawer frame. His fingers traced the joints as he explained the logic. Not just technique. Understanding. Elise watched his hands. The knowledge underneath them was deeper than carpentry. The way he talked about material stress, grain direction, load distribution, it sounded less like woodworking and more like engineering. She didn't say that. She said, "Come look at the building. If it speaks to you, we'll talk." Garrett agreed. Not enthusiastically, not reluctantly. He simply said, "I'll come Tuesday." Elise drove away. At the stop sign on the corner, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The shop was already small behind her, but she could still see him through the window, back at his table, hands moving again. After her car disappeared, a door in the back of the shop swung open, and an 8-year-old boy padded out in socked feet. Nolan Hollis had his father's quiet eyes, and his mother's, his late mother's, sandy hair. He carried a piece of graph paper covered in pencil drawings. "Who was that, Dad?" "New client." "Maybe." Nolan climbed onto the stool next to the workbench and went back to his drawing. It wasn't a house or a car or a superhero. It was a wing, a cross-section of an aircraft wing, with internal spars and ribs, sketched in surprising detail for a child his age. Garrett glanced at it, then looked away. He picked up his sandpaper and kept working. Tuesday came, and Garrett arrived at Carrington House at 7 in the morning, an hour before Elise. He stood outside for a long time, looking up at the facade. 3 stories of Savannah gray brick, iron balconies gone dark with oxidation, windows that still held their original wavy glass. The building had the particular silence of something that had outlasted the people who built it. Elise met him at the front entrance. She had a set of architectural plans rolled under her arm and a hard hat she handed to him without comment. They started on the 3rd floor and worked their way down room by room, wall by wall. Garrett ran his hands over everything. He knocked on plaster, tested floorboards with his weight, pulled a pocket knife and scraped at layers of paint to find the original finish underneath. In the basement, he stopped. The foundation walls were standard for the period brick and lime mortar, but behind a section of wood paneling, He found something else. A steel reinforcement structure, hidden, running through the load-bearing walls in a pattern that made no sense for a 19th-century hotel. Garrett pulled away more paneling. His eyes moved over the steel framework with a recognition that was immediate and technical. "This isn't construction engineering," he said, almost to himself. "This is aerospace-grade stress distribution. Someone retrofitted this with a composite load-bearing matrix, the kind of thing you'd see in a fuselage bulkhead, not a hotel basement." He stopped talking. The silence was sudden, like a door closing. Elise was watching him. She'd managed construction projects for 15 years. She knew the difference between a craftsman who'd learned on the job and someone with formal training in structural mechanics. What Garrett had just described wasn't in any woodworking manual. "Where did you learn about stress distribution in composite structures?" she asked. "I read a lot." It was a nothing answer, and both of them knew it. Elise didn't push, but the question hung between them, a thread she'd eventually pull. 6 miles away, in the law offices of Pratt, Harmon and Associates, Douglas Pratt was running a routine background check. Every contractor working on a Carrington property went through the same screening: criminal history, financial records, professional references. Douglas had done hundreds of them. They were usually boring. This one was not. The results loaded on his screen, and Douglas sat very still. Garrett Hollis, former senior engineer, Lockheed Martin Aeronautics. 14 patents in advanced aerospace materials and composite structures. Total licensing value, estimated $80 million and climbing. Resigned 5 years ago. No public explanation. Douglas knew Garrett. Not from the Carrington world from 8 years ago, when Douglas was still at his old firm. Garrett had been a client. He'd come in 3 months after his wife Sarah died, quiet and precise, to set up a trust fund for his infant son. The attorney-client privilege from that engagement still held. Douglas couldn't disclose what he knew, even now. He picked up the phone and called Garrett directly. "I know who you are," Douglas said. "I won't say anything, but you're walking into Carrington territory, and Vivian Carrington doesn't like surprises." Garrett's voice was even. "I'm just fixing furniture." "No," Douglas said. "You're fixing more than that, and you know it." The line went quiet. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Garrett said, "I appreciate the call, Douglas," and hung up. Douglas set the phone down, looked at the background report still glowing on his screen, and closed the file without forwarding it. He'd keep the secret. But he couldn't stop what was already in motion. The work at Carrington House began the following week. Garrett arrived every morning at 6:30, before the other contractors, and started in the rooms Elise had prioritized: the front parlor, the dining room, the second-floor library, with its built-in shelves that had warped over decades of humidity. He worked alone, methodically, the way he did everything. Elise started coming by in the afternoons. At first, it was project management, checking progress, reviewing timelines, approving material selections. She'd stand at a professional distance and take notes on her phone. But the nature of restoration work made formality difficult. You couldn't discuss the grain pattern of a 130-year-old cypress panel from across the room. You had to be close. You had to touch the same surface. You had to stand shoulder to shoulder and look at the same thing. By the second week, the notes on her phone had slowed. By the third, she was sitting on overturned crates while Garrett worked, talking about things that had nothing to do with wood. She told him about the weight of the Carrington name, how her mother had built the company from 2 hotels to 23, through sheer force and social leverage, how the expectation was 50 properties by the time Vivian retired, and how Vivian showed no intention of retiring. "To my mother, the daughter and the CEO are the same person. There's no separate Elise." Garrett listened. He didn't offer advice. He didn't minimize. He didn't redirect the conversation to himself. He just listened, his hands still moving over the wood, his attention steady and undivided. Elise realized it had been years since someone had simply let her talk without trying to solve her. One afternoon, Garrett asked why she'd chosen restoration over demolition. A new build would be cheaper, faster, simpler. Elise looked at the ballroom ceiling, where water stains mapped decades of storms. Some things shouldn't be torn down just because they're inconvenient. Garrett looked at her. It lasted a beat longer than it should have, long enough to register, not long enough to name. Then he turned back to his work. Vivienne arrived at Carrington House, unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon. She'd come to inspect the construction timeline, or so she told herself. What she found was her daughter sitting on the dusty ballroom floor next to a man in work boots, both of them laughing at something she couldn't hear. The distance between their shoulders was the distance between two people who had forgotten anyone might be watching. Vivienne stood in the doorway. Her face didn't change. She watched for 11 seconds, she counted, then turned and walked back to her car. She dialed Douglas Pratt before she'd pulled out of the parking lot. The contractor. His background, his debts, his record, everything. If he's clean, find what isn't. That night, Garrett came home to find Nolan asleep on the sofa, a book about fighter jets open across his chest. He lifted the boy carefully, carried him to bed, and pulled the blanket up to his chin. Then he stood at the window and looked out at Savannah. In the dark, the live oaks draped in Spanish moss, the streetlights catching the fog rolling in from the river. He thought about Elise, about the way she'd said some things shouldn't be torn down, about the way her voice had sounded when she said it, not philosophical but personal, like she was talking about herself. He stepped back from the window. The last time he'd let someone in, it had been Sarah. And Sarah was gone. The instinct to protect what remained Nolan, the quiet life, the carefully constructed smallness of their world, pulled at him like gravity. Vivienne Carrington launched her campaign on a Thursday evening. Dinner at the family estate, the old house on Gaston Street, with the iron gate and the magnolias that had been there since before the Civil War. White tablecloth, heavy silver, 3 courses prepared by the private chef, and seated directly next to Elise Harrison Webb. 39, Harvard MBA, old Savannah money, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. His father co-owned 4 resort properties with the Carrington Group. He was tall, well-spoken, and precisely the kind of man Vivienne considered appropriate. Elise recognized the setup before the appetizer arrived. The extra place setting, the too casual introduction, the way her mother guided the conversation toward Harrison's accomplishments with the subtlety of a stage director, his development portfolio, his charity board seats, his recent trip to the Amalfi Coast, his thoughts on the future of boutique hospitality. Harrison was charming enough to make it comfortable. Elise was polished enough to make it convincing. Neither of them was fooled into thinking this was spontaneous. At one point, Harrison caught Elise's eye across the table and gave a small, knowing shrug. I didn't plan this either. She almost liked him for that. Almost. After dinner, Vivienne moved to phase 2. She called an emergency session of the Carrington Group board the following Monday and raised questions about the renovation budget for Carrington House. The numbers were within projections. Elise had made sure of that, but Vivienne reframed them as a fiduciary concern. She requested competitive bidding for the restoration contract, a process that required minimum company size, insurance thresholds, and corporate references, requirements that would, as by design, disqualify a one-man shop operating out of a storefront on Broughton Street. The stated reason was fiscal responsibility. The actual reason was sawdust on her daughter's clothes. Elise confronted her mother in the hallway after the board adjourned. The other members filed past them, eyes averted. Vivienne didn't soften. You sit on a concrete floor laughing with a carpenter like you're 16 years old. What do you call that? I call it losing direction. You don't know anything about him. I know enough. Stop this yourself. Or I call a vote of no confidence. Your choice. The threat landed clean and cold. Elise held her mother's gaze for 3 seconds. She wanted to fight. She wanted to say that competence didn't require a corporate letterhead, that the best craftsman she'd ever met didn't need a board's permission to be worthy of respect. But Vivienne wasn't arguing about Garrett's qualifications. She was arguing about control. And you couldn't win a control argument with someone who held 51% of the shares. The math was simple and final. Elise walked away without responding. At the construction site the next morning, Garrett noticed the change. Elise arrived at her usual time but stood farther away. She kept her hands in her jacket pockets. She asked about timelines and materials, nothing else. When he showed her the repair on the parlor mantel, she nodded and made a note on her phone, instead of kneeling down to look the way she usually did. The conversations that had started to open had closed again, and Garrett could feel the shift the way you feel barometric pressure drop before a storm. He didn't ask why. He knew what institutional pressure looked like. He'd felt it himself, years ago, when Lockheed's board had tried to renegotiate his patent terms. The difference was that this pressure wasn't aimed at a contract. It was aimed at a person. Douglas called Garrett that evening. Vivienne pushed for competitive bidding. Your contract could be voided. If they want someone else, I'll go. The problem is she doesn't want you to go. Garrett was quiet for a long time. Then she has a different kind of problem. The work continued. The renovation gave them a reason or an excuse to keep meeting, and neither of them examined which it was. Garrett had moved to the ballroom, the largest room in Carrington House, where the original wainscoting had buckled and split after a century of Savannah summers. He was removing damaged panels when his chisel caught on something behind the wall. It was a metal box, no bigger than a cigar case, wedged between the studs. He pried it loose and opened it. Inside were letters, 6 of them, written on paper so thin it was almost translucent. The handwriting was formal, careful. The ink faded to brown. They were dated 1920. Elise arrived while he was reading the second one. He handed her the first without explanation. She leaned against the wall and read it standing. The letters were love letters, written by the hotel's original owner to a woman his family had forbidden him from seeing. The language was restrained in the way of that era. No declarations, no desperation, but the feeling underneath was unmistakable. 2 people writing to each other across a distance that wasn't measured in miles. Neither Garrett nor Elise commented on the parallel. They didn't need to. The silence between them carried it heavy, specific, impossible to ignore. When Garrett handed her the last letter, their fingers touched. Neither pulled away. It was a small thing, a fraction of a second, but both of them felt it land. That Saturday, Nolan came to the job site with his father. Elise hadn't expected him. The boy sat cross-legged on the ballroom floor with a sketch pad and a mechanical pencil, drawing with the focus of someone 3 times his age. Elise knelt beside him. "What's this one?" "A hotel on the moon," Nolan said. He pointed to a series of careful lines. "This part is the artificial gravity system. You need centrifugal force, so the whole building rotates. But the lobby stays stationary because of the bearing ring here." Elise looked at the drawing. Then she looked at Garrett. He was watching them from across the room, watching his son explain centrifugal force to a woman he barely knew, and his face held an expression Elise had never seen on him before. Soft, unguarded, like a door he usually kept bolted had drifted open on its own. She turned back to Nolan. "Does the restaurant rotate too?" "Obviously. That's the best part." Across town, Vivienne's phone buzzed. A friend from her Savannah social circle had sent a photograph, Elise Carrington, sitting on the floor of a construction site, next to a child, the carpenter's child. Vivienne stared at the image for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Harrison Webb. The Carrington Foundation Gala was next week. Harrison would attend. He would escort Elise. This was not a request. That night, Garrett sat on the edge of Nolan's bed after the boy fell asleep. Nolan's sketchbook had fallen open to a page Garrett hadn't seen, a drawing of 2 figures, sitting side by side, one small, one adult. Underneath, in the careful printing of an 8-year-old, Miss Elise. Garrett closed the book gently and placed it on the nightstand. He sat there for a while, in the dark, listening to his son breathe. The Carrington Foundation Gala occupied the entire ground floor of the flagship hotel. Crystal, white linen, a string quartet in the corner, 300 guests, all of them from the kind of families that measured their Savannah roots in centuries. Vivienne had orchestrated every detail. The seating chart placed Harrison Webb at Elise's side. The press photographers had been tipped about a potential announcement. The stage was set for a narrative Vivienne intended to write herself. Elise wore the role the way she always did, flawlessly, from a distance. She smiled at donors, made small talk with board members, let Harrison hold her elbow as they moved through the crowd. She hated all of it, but this was a family event, and family events were performances. Garrett was not invited. He was, however, present. The restoration of the main lobby was behind schedule, and the ballroom adjacent to the gala space still had temporary curtains dividing the construction zone from the event. Garrett had been working late all week, finishing the crown molding above the lobby entrance. He could hear the music through the curtain. He could hear the laughter and the clinking glasses. Through a gap in the fabric, he saw Elise. She was standing next to Harrison, who was telling a story that required broad hand gestures. Elise was smiling. It was the public smile, the one Garrett had learned to distinguish from the real one. He watched for 3 seconds, then turned back to his work. He didn't feel jealousy. He felt distance, the kind that measurements couldn't describe. At 9:15, a man in a tuxedo pushed through the curtain looking for the restroom. He was mid-60s, silver-haired, with the confident bearing of someone used to being recognized. He stopped when he saw Garrett. "Garrett Hollis?" The man's voice carried genuine shock. "Good God," Martin felled. "We worked together on the advanced materials program at Lockheed. Your composite alloy, we're still using it. The entire division runs on your thermal-resistant bonding process." Garrett set down his chisel. "Martin, it's been a long time. 5 years. Everyone thought you'd gone to a competitor. Or NASA." Nobody guessed he looked around the construction zone. "What are you doing here?" "Restoring a building." You're doing carpentry?" Martin said it, the way someone might say, "You're living underwater." "Garrett, your patents alone are worth—" "Martin." Garrett's voice was quiet but final. "I'd appreciate it if you kept this between us." Martin Feld nodded slowly, still visibly stunned, and retreated back through the curtain. What neither of them had noticed was the woman standing 3 feet away, in the shadow where the curtain met the wall. Vivienne Carrington had stepped out of the gala for air. She'd heard everything. Patents, composite alloys, Lockheed Martin. The entire division runs on your process. She stood perfectly still. The man she had been trying to remove from her daughter's life was not a poor carpenter. He was a scientist, a pioneer who had voluntarily walked away from $80 million to sand furniture in a shop on Broughton Street. Back in the gala, Harrison Webb was describing his family's new resort development in the Bahamas. Elise nodded at appropriate intervals. Her eyes drifted toward the curtain. Vivienne went home early. She sat in her study with the door closed, the house silent around her. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk, the one she never opened when anyone else was in the room. Inside, beneath a stack of old correspondence, was a photograph, black and white, creased at the corners. A young woman barely 20 standing next to a man in work clothes, both of them laughing. The man was not Edward Carrington. The man was someone Vivienne had not spoken about in 40 years. Her hand trembled as she held the photograph. She placed it face down on the desk, then turned it over again. Then face down, then over. She couldn't decide which was worse, seeing it or not seeing it. Vivienne did not share what she'd learned about Garrett Hollis. She buried it the way she buried everything that threatened her control, deep, silent, permanent. Instead, she escalated. She called an emergency board meeting for the following morning, her third in as many weeks, and brought a motion to terminate Garrett's contract immediately and award the restoration to an international design firm based in London. In the boardroom, she made her case without emotion. "We are entrusting a $12 million property to one person. Not a firm, not a team. One person who refinishes furniture. If this contractor were not a man, if there were no personal dimension, would this decision exist?" The room shifted. 2 members who had previously supported Elise exchanged glances. The vote was 4-3. Garrett's contract was terminated. Elise sat in her chair after the vote, her jaw tight, her hands flat on the table. She didn't argue the result. She waited until the room cleared, then found her mother in the hallway. "You don't have the right. I have 51%. I have every right. The only problem here is that you're pretending I don't." Vivienne held her daughter's stare for a full 5 seconds, then walked away. Her heels echoed down the marble corridor, measured, unhurried, absolute. That evening, Elise drove to Broughton Street. The shop was still lit. Garrett was at his bench, finishing a drawer rail for a project that no longer existed. She told him about the vote. He didn't react the way she expected. There was no anger, no surprise, no wounded pride. He set down his tools and wiped his hands on his apron. "I knew this was coming," he said. "Then why did you take the job?" "Because that building deserved to be restored the right way." The sentence sat between them. Both of them understood he wasn't talking only about the building. Elise looked at him. "Who are you?" "Really?" Garrett didn't answer with words. He led her to the back room, the one she'd never seen. It was small, lined with shelves, and completely unlike the rest of the shop. On the walls hung framed certificates, patent documents, photographs. Garrett in a lab coat at Lockheed Martin. Garrett shaking hands with a NASA administrator. 14 patents, neatly framed, covering one entire wall. Everything was dusty. Nothing was displayed with pride. It was stored like something a person keeps but doesn't need. Why hide this? Elise's voice was barely above a whisper. After Sarah died, I needed Nolan to see his father living for something real. Not contracts, not licensing deals. Something you can touch. He picked up a piece of walnut from the workbench and turned it in his hands. Wood doesn't lie. It doesn't negotiate. It just is what it is. Elise stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the evidence of a life Garrett had chosen to leave behind. She didn't pity him. She didn't admire him. She understood him, and the understanding was more intimate than anything either of them had said aloud. She walked to the door, stopped, didn't turn around. I'm going to fix this. Don't fix it for me. I'm not fixing it for you. I'm fixing it because it's right. She stepped out into the Savannah night. Garrett stood in his shop, a piece of unfinished wood still in his hand, and watched the door close behind her. Elise spent 3 days preparing. She worked from 6 in the morning until midnight, alone in her office on the top floor of the Carrington Group headquarters, the Savannah skyline darkening and brightening outside her window. While she built her case, she didn't use Garrett's secret. She didn't mention Lockheed Martin, the patents, the $80 million. That was his story to tell, not her weapon to deploy. If she won this, she would win it on the merits of the project, not on the revelation that the carpenter her mother despised was quietly wealthier than half the board. Instead, she built her case on numbers. The international firm Vivian, preferred Aldrich and Stone, based in London, would cost 4 times Garrett's contract. Their timeline was 18 months against his 8. They had no experience with heritage restoration. Their portfolio was modern luxury glass, steel, minimalist aesthetics, the opposite of what Carrington House required. Elise pulled case studies from 3 comparable restoration projects in Charleston and New Orleans, showing cost overruns when heritage buildings were handed to firms without period-specific expertise. She compiled every data point into a presentation that was ruthless in its precision. 47 slides, no emotion, no personal appeals, just math. Douglas Pratt helped from the margins. He provided Elise with the legal framework for calling an extraordinary board session a CEO's prerogative written into the company charter that Vivienne couldn't block procedurally, though she'd surely try. Douglas also quietly forwarded 2 neutral board members, Margaret Hale and Richard Boone, both of whom had backgrounds in real estate development, a risk analysis showing the project timeline disruption and potential insurance complications that a midstream contractor change would cause. He never mentioned Garrett's name. He didn't need to. The numbers carried the argument on their own. The morning of the board meeting, Vivienne found Elise in the lobby of the Carrington Group offices. Elise was standing at the window, holding a coffee she hadn't touched. Vivienne stopped beside her. She didn't look angry. For the first time in weeks, she looked tired, genuinely tired, in a way that makeup and posture couldn't disguise. You think I'm cruel. I'm not cruel. I've stood exactly where you're standing, and I know how the story ends. She walked away before Elise could respond. Elise watched her go. The cadence was different. The sharpness was gone. In its place was something Elise hadn't heard before, not defeat, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone fighting a battle on 2 fronts, one of them invisible. For the first time, Elise felt something other than anger toward her mother. She felt worry. The board convened at 10 in the walnut-paneled conference room on the 4th floor. 7 members seated around the oval table, Vivienne at one end, Elise at the other. Elise presented for 22 minutes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't mention her mother. She walked through the cost comparison, the timeline analysis, the heritage restoration credentials, the risk assessment, the insurance implications. When she finished, she closed her laptop, sat down, and folded her hands on the table. The vote was 5-2. Garrett's contract was reinstated. Vivienne voted against. When the result was announced, she didn't argue. She didn't slam the table or make a speech. She stood, buttoned her jacket slowly, and walked out of the boardroom without a word. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded, to Elise, louder than anything her mother had ever said. Elise had won the corporate battle. But watching her mother's back disappear through that door, the slight slope of her shoulders, the measured pace that had replaced the usual commanding stride, she didn't feel like she'd won anything at all. Elise drove to the Carrington estate that evening. Not to confront, not to claim victory. She went because something in her mother's voice that morning, the tiredness, the strange vulnerability, had unsettled her more than any threat ever had. Her mother had spent 40 years never showing weakness. The crack in the facade that morning felt more alarming than anything Vivienne had done in anger. Vivienne was in her study. The door was open, which was unusual. Vivienne kept her study closed, the way other people kept diaries locked. She was sitting in the leather chair by the window, and on the desk in front of her was the photograph, the one from the bottom drawer. The young woman and the man in work clothes, both laughing in what looked like a park. Vivienne made no move to hide it. Elise sat down across from her. Neither spoke for a long time. The house was quiet. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked the seconds. Then Vivienne started talking, and her voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. His name was James Kavanaugh. He was a construction engineer, hands like sandpaper, laughed too loud, drove a truck that was older than he was. She touched the edge of the photograph with one finger. I was 22. He was 25. We met at a city planning meeting. I was there for my father's firm. He was there for the contractors' union. He argued with my father about load-bearing standards for 20 minutes. My father was furious. I thought it was the most alive anyone had ever been in a room with us. She paused. The clock on the mantel ticked. My family, your grandmother, your grandfather, they told me it was a phase, that I'd outgrow it. When I didn't outgrow it, they stopped asking and started arranging. Her jaw tightened. They arranged my marriage to your father. Edward was everything James wasn't. Right family, right name, right future. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself love was a luxury that women in our position couldn't afford. Her voice thinned. James died 6 months after I left him. Construction accident. A beam collapsed on a site in Beaufort. He was 26 years old. The room was very quiet. 40 years. And I still don't know if I'd stayed. Would he have been on that site? Would he have taken that job? Would he still be alive? She looked at Elise. Her eyes were wet, but her gaze was steady and unblinking. You want to live with that question? Elise's chest ached. She understood now. Not just the motive, the architecture of it. Vivienne wasn't a villain. She was a woman who had been broken by the same choice she was now forcing on her daughter. The cycle wasn't cruelty. It was terror, deep, old, unprocessed terror dressed up as authority. Elise reached across the desk and took her mother's hand. Vivienne flinched, then held on. I'm not you, Mom. Garrett isn't James, but if it ends badly, that's my choice to make, not yours. Mine. Vivienne was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost inaudible. I know he's not an ordinary carpenter. Eliza froze. At the gala, I overheard. The patents. Lockheed Martin. Vivienne's eyes held her daughter's. I knew, and I still tried to stop you. Why? Because money doesn't protect you from loss. I've been wealthy my entire life, and I still lost the most important thing I ever had. They sat together in the study, the old photograph between them on the desk. No embrace, no tears, just silence, but for the first time in years, it was a silence without walls. A month passed. Carrington House was nearly finished. The ballroom floor, 130 years of heart pine, gleamed under the restored chandelier. The wainscoting was seamless. The crown molding curved overhead like it had been carved yesterday and aged a century overnight. Garrett was fitting the last piece of the main doorframe, a keystone block of salvaged oak that he'd shaped by hand over 3 days. Elise arrived in the late afternoon for the final walkthrough. They moved through the building together, room by room, without saying much. They stopped at the places that carried their shared history: the crack in the third-floor ceiling that Garrett had spent 2 weeks repairing, the brass door handles he'd polished by hand, because the machine buffer would have erased the original tooling marks, the window where the afternoon light came through, and through the shadow of the oak tree across the floor like a sundial. They didn't narrate it. They just paused, looked, and moved on. The building held the story for them. Nolan burst through the front door at 4:30, backpack bouncing, a rolled piece of paper in his fist. He ran straight to Elise and unrolled it in front of her. Carrington House moon version. The drawing showed the hotel floating in space, connected to a lunar surface station by a glass elevator. The artificial gravity ring was prominently featured. The restaurant, as promised, rotated. Elise laughed. It came out unguarded, a sound Garrett realized he'd never heard from her. Not the polished social laugh, not the careful professional chuckle, something uncontrolled and real. "Miss Elise, do you want to see Dad's shop? He has a new table that isn't finished yet." Garrett looked at his son, then at Elise. He said nothing. Elise looked back. "I'd like that." At 5:15, the front door of Carrington House opened one more time. Vivienne Carrington walked into the lobby alone. She stood in the center of the restored space, turning slowly, taking in every surface, every joint, every line of light. She ran her hand along the oak door frame that Garrett had just completed. Her fingers moved the way Garrett's did, slowly, reading the grain, feeling the work underneath the finish. She didn't say anything to Garrett. She didn't need to. She turned to Elise and nodded once, so slight it was almost invisible. Elise nodded back. That was all. No apology, no formal acceptance, no speech about being wrong, just a nod, and both of them knew what it carried. Vivienne left. The door closed behind her without sound. Outside Carrington House, the late sun turned the Savannah sky amber and gold. The live oaks lining the street were heavy with Spanish moss, their branches reaching across the road like arms. Nolan sat on the front steps, drawing something new, his pencil moving in quick, sure strokes. Garrett reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of wood. It was the first piece he'd cut from Carrington House when the restoration began, a scrap of the original heart pine, no bigger than a thumb. He'd sanded it smooth, polished it with beeswax, and drilled us to one hole through one end. A pendant. He held it out to Elise without a word. She took it. Her fingers closed around it slowly, feeling the grain against her palm. She didn't put it on. She just held it the way you hold something that means more than its size. Under the Savannah oaks, the city settled into the golden hour. Neither of them had been looking for this. No declarations were made, no promises offered, just two people standing beside each other in front of an old building they'd brought back together from the edge of forgetting. And that, for now, was enough.